factor myself. So if I just get rid, hello everybody.
Hello. I wasn't able to hear you there for a little while, Brendan. I only heard you in the last couple of seconds, so I don't know.
Did you hear me, Hugh?
Nope, I was the same as John.
All right, okay.
So we might not have been broadcasting to the nation or indeed to the world.
So I will just quickly repeat. We're looking at the Disney factor. We're going to do a series of Doctor Who debates on the future of Doctor Who. This one is specifically on the Disney factor, and of course, we're looking at how did here's Michelle. How did fandom and the media receive the news of the Disney BBC partnership? We'll look at the Disney effect and what actually that is, the benefits of it, are the possible disadvantages. What is the deal? What changes shall we expect to Doctor Who? Is Disney more saviour than executioner of Doctor Who? You know, that kind of thing is what we're looking at here. So thanks, everybody. Straight into it. What is everybody's first perceptions of the Disney BBC deal as was announced about a year or so back? John?
Oh, right. You know me, I'm quite reticent about expressing an opinion. Ahoy to Green Pling Balloon and Jamie. Thanks for the hellos there. Hi, Michelle. Oh, she's popped off. See, I have that effect on women.
She'll be back.
When I heard initially about the Disney deal, I have to say my heart sank, chiefly because I've never been the biggest of Disney fans. My husband very much is. And so I was very well aware of what Disney does. And as far as I was concerned, it perhaps didn't fit in with my view of what Doctor Who is or was or should be. So there was a little bit of palpitations within me. But, you know, I'm prepared to give everybody a fair break and see what it wants to, because ultimately, Doctor Who in the era of streaming has to have a streaming giant behind it if it's going to be big, and the BBC obviously want this thing to be big, and Disney's amongst the biggest in the world. So if you temper my misgivings about the Disney brand and what it brings to Doctor Who with my general feeling that Disney as an international brand can be good for Doctor Who's profile and maybe therefore its future, then that's also to the good too. But I would also temper that again with this notion that is it saving Doctor Who at any cost? And what effectively, if it's a Disney Doctor Who, what is it that we're saving, or what is it about to become?
Hugh?
I was thinking about this, and you know, one of the things that, as John said, it's very beneficial to have a streaming giant behind you, which comes up all sorts of pictures that probably shouldn't be shown on children's television.
Talk to Donald Trump about streaming giant.
But the thing that strikes me about it is that while we're very well aware of what Disney is, this is Disney Plus, this is streaming, it's different for them. I see it as a sort of to look at what happened in the Giggle. I think it's a bit
keep dropping me. I fucking don't know what to do.
Okay, let's have a look. So are you still there, Michelle? Let's have a look. Sorry, Hugh, keep going.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of like by generation of both the BBC and Disney Plus. And I think it's them looking at what they actually want to achieve. And I think for Disney Plus, there's obviously a huge benefit in getting known brands as well. So that's why you've got Marvel as part of it, and the Star Wars part. I don't know what Disney Plus wants, and I'm not sure they do. So I think it's I almost think it's new Disney Plus, new Doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a few things listed down that I you know, when I heard about the deal, etc., and I'll show a few details about that. But, you know, I was wondering about the creative input. I was wondering about will there be the woke agenda a certain way. There's nothing wrong with woke per se, but it depends what that actually is and what it means for the Doctor Who franchise. The Americanization elements, nothing wrong with Americans, but the Americanization of a uniquely British show might be a problem. The big budget's not a problem. The big budget might mean problematic writing, lazy writing. People lazily talk about Disneyfication of things anyway. We'll talk about what does that mean, Disneyfication of something. I'm well aware, as having been a teacher, that you had The Little Mermaid when it was made. They rewrote it so that the ending was, easy to absorb and digest, and we didn't have the pain forevermore because you fancied a man. That was taken out. We know the issues I've had with Snow White. I know there were issues with The Lion King because actually in those days, the baddie had a darker fur, and it was a big issue then. And it was an English actor, Jeremy Irons. And of course, the issue there was English are always baddies. That was accepted as their trope. But that, so I'm reading into all that. And the other thing is, Disney, just like a lot of American brands, if they are inheriting a franchise or a piece of, literature from somewhere else, they like to gloss over awkward details. They like to gloss over sometimes cultural issues and stuff like that. And that was my concern. Now, to
quite
get
a lot
rid
there
of
to be concerned about.
Say that again, John. Sorry.
There's quite a lot there to be concerned about.
Yeah.
Can I just say that in terms of one thing Hugh mentioned right at the start was about why Disney Plus, particularly looking for brands that are pre-existent and have a fan base, if you like, and going for that. I would imagine that one of the reasons Doctor Who appeals, particularly now we know that RTD is going to give a more fantastical base or fantasy-based notion to it. It may well be they're looking for a Harry Potter-esque type brand, and maybe Doctor Who's in this iteration is to become that. That Harry Potter is going to become a TV series streamed throughout the world. Maybe Doctor Who becoming a fantasy-based series and will become the BBC and Disney Plus's answer to that.
Well, and of course, some of it's going to manifest itself as time goes on. We'll kind of know. Now, what I wanted to do first of all is start with our first kind of debate question. You can bring in any of your answers, but we've had 4 specials now. I remember seeing your face, John, when we discussed the church on Ruby Road, and I showed you the item where Russell Davies himself had admitted that they had to change something or add something to the program after Disney's notification of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to discuss various things, but I'll start with our first question, so to speak. Okay. Okay, so take that away. So
very intriguing music. I'm intrigued by the music.
So I mean, it's a leading question, but have we seen any signs, worrying or promising, of a Disney influence yet?
Well, obviously we have. The first thing you talked about my face was that we were all assured that Disney would have no artistic influence, plus or otherwise, into the Doctor Who, the series. It was being very much run by Russell Davies and his team at Bad Wolf in Cardiff. And then we find out there's a whole chunk of writing, a bit of a scene put in there, not at the instruction, but on the note of Disney. So you have to say to yourself, well, okay, why were we told something which wasn't true? That's the first thing, because it may well be that people will be pleased about Disney having creative input into Doctor Who. It didn't make sense to me at the time why Disney would be investing very heavily in a brand like Doctor Who and not having at least an executive producer type role, overview of what would be happening, considering it would be if you like, a major brand on their streaming channel. But also, I'd ask, so why did they lie is the first question. Why would they want to tell us that when, if you like, 4 stories in, 4 episodes in, we get the producer, Russell Davies, the showrunner, telling us quite openly that he was given a note by Disney to write a whole scene in. And as it turns out, it was to the better of the programme because we get to meet the Doctor a bit sooner, and we get introduced to the Doctor prior than we would have done had it been left to the original script. So, two things going on here. One, well, we're sold a fib, but secondly, the note from Disney was actually a very constructive one, because I think, as I said at the time, that episode, which had a practical effect, if you like, more so than a CGI effect, was probably the most Doctor Who-ish that Ncuti was in the whole of the episode. You know, I'm a doctor, occupation, not a doctor. I liked all that. That's very much in the spirit of Doctor Who. So if Disney's influence can give a good note like that, then I don't mind it so much. But I still wonder about the whole entangle of, no, they're not having creative input, when very obviously they are.
I mean, just before you, I mean, Hugh, come in when you can on this one. I'll just show the example that we're saying. You can see on the screen, this was the very last thing to be added, said Russell Davies. Disney always tests the first episode, and they tested this, and people wanted to see the Doctor earlier. Simple as that. They came back with that note, and I was like, well, actually, okay, who doesn't want to see Ncuti? Davies is still thought to have the final say, but the streamer's input will well prove beneficial to Doctor Who, as John's just said then, from how it helped that episode. And then there's another example. He put it another way when he says it was an expensive new opening. We broke our backs to do it, but we think it's been brilliant and worthwhile. So, you know.
So I think there's a couple of things there. One of the things that immediately strikes me is that that's come not from some executive at Disney who said, we want to see something that is really good for the Disney brand, but is based on an audience review of it. And that makes it, I think, somewhat different in terms of the impact. So maybe the fib that we were sold was that there wouldn't be someone looking after the Disney brand in a way, but that they would still have input from the feedback of audiences. I then worry, though, that the feedback from audiences on something like Doctor Who could well have restricted decisions in the past, artistic decisions that would make it a simpler and less challenging program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned in our church on Ruby Road review, and I'll bring Michelle in a second, but I've put the question at the bottom, Michelle, that we're discussing as a general term. But I'm concerned about, I agree with John that scene in itself. I mean, you see the Doctor earlier, you know, he's a bit more heroic in that aspect, and you know, bring them in earlier, fair dues.
He's not a bit more heroic. He's a bit more like the Doctor that we all thought we knew, you know, just that there's a bit of a background with the policeman, I think.
I understand that, the dialogue, etc. there. Although, as I said at the time, it was a bit over smug, I thought, to a degree. You know, the Doctor who knows everything. I can't stand that. He's supposed to be an anti-hero. But however, my concern is you've got American panels watching, you know, an episode and thinking, right, we need this tinkering with, or is this impatience to see the main character? Is this just doctoring at the edges, saying, well, you know, we don't want mood built up or atmosphere built up? And I just have that concern. But equally, you see, I'll show I haven't got the contract, obviously, but I'll show that the Telegraph's discussed it, and they said basically it should be just streaming support. You know, they're hosting the streaming across globally, and their other element is production support. That's what was promised. But obviously, they have their feet under the table, just as Bad Wolf does. Sony does, because Sony obviously is part of a deal with Bad Wolf. The BBC does, and Disney does. Anyway, hello, Michelle. I know you've had problems internet-wise. I can see you've moved room. Now, obviously, as our American correspondent, so to speak, as I said last time, have you seen any worrying or promising signs of the Disney factor yet in the 4 specials, or any rumours you've heard?
No, the only thing that came out really was that Disney has sent the notes through focus groups that they had needed the Doctor to come on earlier in the snowman scene, and that kind of confirmed what was always kind of suspected, that Disney would have more involvement than just being a streaming service. Disney, they do, through their history of voice, relied a lot on focus groups on their product. So that's really kind of confirmed our feelings in the United States that Disney was going to be more than just a streaming service for the Doctor in North America.
Yeah, and I don't know. Is it my little bias as a little Brit here that all these panel and focus groups? This is what makes the worst out of politicians. Panel and focus groups. This is what makes us the worst of all those sitcoms I used to make in America, where they have a writers' room of about 20 writers and they ponder things. Now, in some ways, they're great, come up with great punchlines, but I just always find them formulaic, because they were trying to hit certain buttons and do all that lot. So I know what you're saying, but to me, it bothers me that they're going to possibly go down that road. Has anyone got any comments on this kind of the writer's room idea, focus groups, drama by numbers?
It's not going to be a writer's room. Russell Davies is very much in charge of this in terms of being not just a lead writer, but very much the creative influence behind this. He is influencer in chief, if you like, behind Doctor Who, and he has charted out what's going to happen, I think, at least over the next 2-3 series. I think he's made that fairly explicit. I think the broader idea is whether or not on the day-to-day things will be run by Bad Wolf in Cardiff, but when the product is close to being completed and run past the wider partnership, at that point they get to come in and decide what works for them or not, and then that could be a bit of too many cooks, spoiling the broth. Taking what is one person's vision and turning it into a vision of a whole group of people who are playing to different markets in this case. Because let's be honest about this, the American market is very different from the British market. Our expectations about Doctor Who are different, and I think one of the charms about Doctor Who in the American market is how British it is. And one would hope that Disney would understand that and not be trying to make too much of a generic look to the character for transatlantic audiences. When that was tried in 1996, it failed, and it failed very badly in America because they didn't play up to the British charm of the Doctor. They tried it, they dabbled with it, but ultimately it ended up in a bit of transatlantic pap, for want of a better phrase. So I think the danger for Doctor Who will be that when the creative force that is Russell Davies has had his way, but when the execs gather around a table and all start chipping in, then that could be the danger point for Doctor Who.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously just put this up to kind of reinforce your point about too many cooks. So you've got the Guardian's Martin Bellham saying there's certainly a lot more hands on the show now, one way or another, with the BBC, Bad Wolf, in which Sony has a stake, and Disney all having a seat at the table. Where I think the show will benefit most of all is from a global uniform publicity drive with the heft of Disney Plus behind it.
Yeah, and you've got to remember, Doctor Who at its very, very best was basically run by a producer and a script editor who eventually showed it to their head of department, and who generally waved it through, apart from the occasional note about violence or humour or whatever. So Doctor Who at its best had one or two people running it, so that's the worry.
Because you do need a strong head of the helm to be able to fight back sometimes, because sometimes the notes from Disney aren't, or the executives aren't the best for the product. There's a famous story in the late 1980s when they were test screening Little Mermaid. And the first time they test screened it, when the song Part of Your World came on, a little child dropped his popcorn and was fidgety. And Disney took that, the executives who were viewing the screening took that as the song needed to be cut. And Howard Ashman, who was the song writer, fought for that and said, no, I'm not going to let a bratty kid ruin my song or ruin my picture. They kept Part of Your World in there. Next screening went wonderful. That's now a classic Disney song. So you need to have sometimes the suits and the creative need to be able to have that balance back, coming back, and still keeping that creative drive and knowing when to answer back to the suits.
And I bring in this into play. We don't know if this is linked to the to the partnership with Disney, but I have my suspicions. I really do, because Russell Davies does love the Davros character, does love Genesis of the Daleks, and I just wonder why he suddenly changed what he was doing here. And of course, you know, it's well trodden path in fandom now, the discussion of Destination Scarrow. But my suspicions are it's because of that Disney link. Can't prove it.
No.
But I do wonder whether this kind of tidying up of awkward story writing in the past, awkward canon, awkward characters, challenging characters. This is the tidying up, the purifying of the Doctor Who brand for a global market. That is my suspicion.
Well, he even kind of admits it in his interview, that other people brought it to the forefront that this was a problem character. When he in the Doctor Who Unleashed, he kind of implies that it really wasn't him at first. I saw a problem with those other people brought to his attention.
Yeah, Hugh,
isn't that one of those things where they talk about, you know, a camel is a horse designed by committee, but in terms of this type of committee, what we end up with is a chair rather than a horse. Because you simplify and simplify rather than allow the complexity. And I think that's my worry, that, you know, not just whether it will be to some form of agenda, but that the stories will become simpler. The bits where it's not clear what it is will become simpler because it will want to be explained to everyone. And at that stage, it's not going to be that interesting.
And it has been interesting that when I was looking at any details about the deal itself, there were question marks about, gosh, Disney, this great streaming platform, doesn't want to actually show any of the Whoniverse, the classic Who, the new Who area. Why is that? Is it because they think it's just, you know, there's 60 years of detail there. They'd rather have season 1 reboot, which is what they want to call it. So, you know, there is a kind of bit of evidence that they want to just start again, and they don't want all the awkward details of the past, which would fall into the Destination Scarrow.
The season 1 thing is entirely understandable, absolutely understandable. Even Stephen Moffat, when he took over Doctor Who from Russell Davies, there was talk by the new production team at that point about calling Matt Smith's season 1 rather than season 5 at the time. That was purely because there's this expectation that people think when they see a program 5-6 seasons in, oh, it's old hat, I can't be able to play catch up, I want to start at the beginning. The old story about the madness of King George III being renamed because the Americans would say, what happened to 1 and 2? You know, so there's that argument there. So that's always existed. Now that Doctor Who is officially going to a major streamer, I can understand them calling it season 1, purely to get that first night audience, for want of a better phrase. So that doesn't trouble me. They can call it season 1, season 14, season 20. What would be 30 what? If Doctor Who is still 26 and 14. Season 40 would be then, wouldn't it? Yeah. If we were counting from the original season.
I understand
so you can call it what they will. That's irrelevant to me. And purely
what about the fact that Disney didn't want to stream the rest of Who? In other words, they've made a separation. I understand your point. But they, with that great streaming service that it is, and you know, Doctor Who can be found on BBC iPlayer now. It was on BritBox, etc. I think it still is on there, isn't it? But you know, why didn't Disney want to do that? And of course, when you think of all the characters like Davros and that, I just wonder, there is a suspicion there. Taking your point still, John, and I saw Michelle was nodding too, but taking that point on board, I still just wonder why they do want that deeper separation with such a powerful franchise, with characters and stories. And
why then start it? If that's the case, why then start it with an old Doctor, an old companion's family, and everything that went the 3 episodes before Shruti's first? It was chock full of previous canon that people would have to get used to. People could or would not want to jump onto that. So again, it sounds as though I'm defending this again. I'm just trying to be practical and realistic about it. Yes, Disney would want as fresh a start as they can possibly get to secure as big an audience as they can possibly have. And it's just a virtue of show business and television and films that all properties tend not to attract a new audience as quickly as you might want them to. Maybe streaming is a bit different from broadcast television because it's just published and people can dip in and dip out of it. I don't know. But the fact is, they did start this Disney era with an old doctor, an old companion, and an old adversary.
They did, and what's interesting is if you just take a look at this, that actually Disney did try and acquire Doctor Who back in the 1980s. Obviously, different world then, and they were going to add that. If you look at the bottom there, Disney planned to install a Doctor Who attraction at Tomorrowland, where they would announce a new incarnation and all that stuff. It ended up going to Star Wars instead, but they've had their eyes on this for quite a while. My middle column is just kind of the deal and how wonderful everything seems to be. But Den of Geek made a point coming back to the Power of the Doctor, the centenary special, which he gathered from the Telegraph. However, the Telegraph has found that the deal doesn't just involve streaming rights, but also production support. The corporate might of Disney will give the show vast budgets beyond the BBC's means, allowing for more cinematic production values and more stars. With this capital, Doctor Who could now boast resources similar to other Disney shows, potentially expanding its storylines, etc., and its capabilities. That's all to the good, but as we say, editorially, feet under the table, I might start venturing by saying, we'd like this, we'd like that, we'd like the other. Michelle or Hugh, what would you like to react?
Makes a good point about I believe one of the reasons that they have a season one is just that it's easy to pick up. I don't really see that as concerning, though I understand the concerns behind it. Though I don't see that as concerning. I am wondering maybe part of the reason why the next season we're not going to have any old villains, maybe because it's seen as the bridge season to get people into looking into the past, to go start Googling and looking up at websites to get more familiar with the Doctor's history. I am kind of curious about with it being on Disney, we haven't seen it yet, is merchandising. Will the Disney Store be picking up on Doctor Who? And also, will we starting to every week, it becomes a huge success again, or it starts picking up, will we start seeing things in the park? Because there is a little bit of brand fatigue. Because Gory Vidal, you made a great comment about the Marvel and Star Wars. There is a little bit of brand fatigue in Marvel and Star Wars right now in the United States. The new sequel trilogy, or whatever they want to call it, with the newer characters did not pick up. And at the parks, the attractions connected directly with the newer characters, like the Star Cruising Hotel, did not do very well. So yeah, there is a little bit of brand fatigue on some of these older products.
Hugh?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. So the whole series and stuff like that, I think, is one of the reasons why, in terms of that, you tend to have spin-offs in Star Wars and spin-offs in the Marvel universe, which can be treated as new, and that obviously is one of those things which there's a cost to this. If you create something new, it doesn't have the follow on from other people, but at the same time, you have the chance to say this is our work and that this is what we're doing. I'm sort of left with a wonder here that I'm not sure what the BBC wants out of this either. I think that I can sort of see Disney's point of view because they are streaming and that's what they do. I can see, obviously, Bad Wolf's point of view because that's what they do. And I see Russell T Davies's. I think the BBC in this deal, particularly given the politics surrounding what's happening with the BBC, is an interesting thing about whether it gets anything out of having something that's this big.
I have so many so many questions. It's like we've all seen the giggle now when the Shooty Doctor rests the David Tennant Doctor, and he referenced loads of, you know, Logopoulos, Mavic Chen, and everybody. Now, what we've got here is Russell Davies says, as a kind of reassurance that this deal won't threaten Doctor Who in any way, Davies goes on to give a cryptic clue. If you want any more reassurance, let me just tell you that we're about to transmit the words Mavic Chen on television for the first time. Yeah, you didn't show him, and you don't show the character. I mean, it's easy to say to the fans, and I think in a devious way, John, honestly, because Russell Davies sells well. And he is a good promoter. The thing is, he's kind of, you know, he's saying there, you know, well, Mavic Chen is mentioned, so therefore Old Who is safe. Yeah, mentioned. I mean, please, that's hardly selling the fact that Old Who is still going to come back.
Who cares? Who cares? Again, it's all to do with good stories and writing. I don't care if Mavic Chen gets a mention, yea or nay. It's an absolute irrelevance. What's more relevant is what the point was Hugh brought up, is the role of the BBC in this. Absolutely. The BBC is entering a whole new era of looking for a role, because as the licence fee for those outside of the UK, BBC is a state broadcaster funded by what is effectively a poll tax. And most people, myself included, pay this, and for years and years, paid it quite happily. But the BBC is increasingly chasing a younger audience who don't watch linear television and therefore won't pay the licence fee. So, and at the same point, they're ignoring their perhaps stalwart audience, as people of my generation and above, in a lot of the programming. So, in a bid to recapture or get hold of a new audience, they're alienating an old audience, and the audience they are creating are the people who are more likely to pay for them if they had a subscription service. So that's the dichotomy for the BBC there. What's in it for them with Doctor Who? Apart from a bit of cash, the BBC has never known what to do with Doctor Who. They've never known the power of the brand. They tried unsuccessfully throughout its initial run to kill it several times, succeeding in 1989. And again, it was the lure of Hollywood that brought it back in 96. And only the sheer absolute bloody mindedness of Russell Davies brought it back again in 2005. But for his determination and Doctor Who fandomness, Doctor Who wouldn't coming back, because part of the deal of him working for the BBC was that it had to be on Doctor Who. And the BBC just wanted Russell Davies more than they ever wanted Doctor Who. And only when he ran the show and ran it very, very, very well, did they realise, my goodness, this thing has caught on. Subsequent to that,
do you think
they don't really know what to do with it? So they've quite happily handed this product over to an independent production company and a streamer like Disney, in the hope that they do. And it may well be that, for all the fact that you have your concerns, Brendan, about whether Mavic Chen gets remembered or not, it may well be that this is Doctor Who's future. It might not be the Doctor Who that you and I particularly like or want, but then again, it's not just for us.
But I think it's all part that these are all clues to a bigger point. And I had a lot of people texting me today about our program today, because they are concerned generally about the future of Doctor Who. Disney might be a factor in that. Now, we've mentioned various things. Now, I want to just join two things together, and then please come in, everybody. But basically, Gore Vidal says, I think the Doctor is in deeper trouble with or without Russell Davies. The first Tennant special did not bring in the huge numbers one expected. Many dropped off. Now, I know you've been mentioning the streaming services, and it's all Generation Z are watching things differently. I get that. And I think the Star Beast is up to about 9.5 million views now, if you want to count them for a month. But the other point I wanted to kind of bring in, and I think Hugh mentioned this earlier, was we've been here before. As soon as the BBC were losing interest in Doctor Who, as you said, John, and they didn't know what to do with it, so they get Fox in and they try and get other people in. We had the McGann movie. And of course, that did start to introduce elements that weren't in Doctor Who before. Now, whether they become canon, whether they are of interest, whether they are ignored, the point is the doctoring of the program has started from that moment. I think, Hugh, you've mentioned the sexualization of the Doctor,
Yeah.
the kiss.
Which I think is the biggest disaster in terms of what's happened since 1996 and then being kept on. We've mentioned obviously the half human thing, which has just been ignored. I would quite like that the kiss had been ignored, because I do think, I look at the relationship that you've got between Shooty and Ruby and whoever else comes on board, and it's problematic. That's why whenever they had Kirsten Tate came on as Donna Noble, I breathed a sigh of relief, because it was of the joke of making that nothing's going to happen, not in a way that of traditional things of will they, won't they in Moonlighting or something like that, but that nothing was going to happen, just made it a huge relief, because you could enjoy the stories a lot more rather than worrying about the soap opera bit of it.
Now, Michelle, as our American representative there, I mean, what did you find about, some of the people who've texted me about, they're worried about the Disney influence. I wonder whether we're worried about the Americanization of Doctor Who. And so I'm just wondering, since that has been happening for a while, whether you saw concerns with the McGann movie onwards. And I've got Matt Smith there and a Stetson, not because I'm being obviously American and tokenistic, but there is an argument. I've got the clip there of the Pandorica where he was stood at Stonehenge shouting to all his villains and enemies in the stars and spaceships, as if he was some Marvel superhero, which is not Doctor Who. Did you have any concerns before Disney arrived about the Americanization of Doctor Who, or losing the British element of it?
My concern just generally with Disney was I wanted them to keep out of the writer's room. And unfortunately, that looks like that's happening. So that was what I'm always concerned of having people who don't have an invested interest in the show coming in trying to push what they think Doctor Who is. But you go back, the revival has always been different from the original Doctor Who, the classic Doctor Who. So I think change is inevitable. I mean, you can't have a franchise that is 60 years old and not have change. We're seeing that in Star Wars. We're seeing that in Star Trek. Now is that was liked? Yes or no, depending on what era a person came on board to. And I think one thing, like it or not, for it to survive, there was always going to need to be change. And this isn't what you like, that's perfectly okay. I mean, there's nobody saying you have to like and love everything. When you have 60 errors of something, you're going to always have one period or one episode that you just didn't like. That's just natural nature. I kind of goes back to last week. Do we want it to go away? Are we having fans that are so grumpy or so proprietary that they want it to go away so that they can have it in their little box and not have new people come in? I think that is a very good question to ask. And of course, there's always going to be people like that who didn't like it, that started becoming popular. Because I remember. Before I became a fan, I was aware of Doctor Who because you would walk into Barnes and Nobles, which is our major booksellers, and you would see Doctor Who products. You go into Hot Topic, which is kind of for young adults. I still shop there, whatever. But it's it's fan merch, and Hot Topic had all Doctor Who for the longest period of time. And I know a lot of people, even then, were upset. You read on the chat boards that they blame Smith for bringing in all of these teenage fans who didn't stay around for the Capaldi era. So it was the Smith fans that the ratings were dropping. So yeah, you're always going to have change. Change is good. Again, sometimes it's not going to be the same Doctor Who that we recognize, but if we enjoy the ride and we enjoy the stories, that's perfectly okay.
Yeah,
and I also think it's interesting that the last couple of years that the classic era is getting much more love, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and part of the change I wanted to join in on and add to your point there, Michelle, because I've put these two elements up on the screen, which is while we are talking about the Disney factor and the future of Who, and we need to be fair, of course, which is their link with Star Wars, I mean, there were lots of fears that they would, as it says, kidify Star Wars, that they would really dumb it down. But actually, a lot of people argue that Rogue One was very bleak and very, you know, adult in many ways, The Last Jedi. The kidifying, dumbing down effect that people feared did not manifest actually in reality with what they did with the Star Wars legacy. Nobody on that one?
I think that's I'm not sure you can codify Star Wars that much. I think sort of if you're making differences, then it allows you to do different things, and you can deal with different audiences. I think that's fine. I clarify my comment. I'm not really objecting to the sexualization for saying something I don't like. In terms of the storyline for what happens now, I'm saying it makes me feel deeply uncomfortable because by the narrative you have a power dynamic which gets abused.
Yeah.
So it's a very specific thing. So it's not. My worry is that you have I'm not quite sure how old Shooty is in this incarnation, but you have a 1,000-year-old plus person with a 19-year-old person and their friends, and it the whole thing having sort of like gone through the variety of things which are problematic in very many other television programs. I think they're setting themselves up for a real problem in the narrative.
And while we do a series of Doctor Who debates, one of them is very soon is going to be on that very topic, actually, Hugh. So if everybody, you know, we're not going to develop that now, but basically looking at maybe since the McGann movie. Now, while I'm just talking, of course, everybody, please, we're a new channel. We've been on about 3.5 weeks. I'm really living on the goodwill and support of, number one, my fellow panelists and their time, and also anybody joining us and supporting us out there. We appreciate it. Please, just give us a subscribe, you know, keep us going. However, whether you want me to invite you, charm you, or do a little beat the meat threaten there, but please join us. It's been a fantastic ride for the last 3.5 weeks, but I am really reliant on everybody's goodwill here. And so we want to continue these Doctor Who debates, and that would be something we would be discussing. Me and Hugh were talking about that. And yes, I think it deserves a whole debate in itself. Now, just to kind of go on a different path. Don't think I'm going to go off Disney, everybody. I'm doing this deliberately just to kind of hit an example. So this is the 2nd of January. Now, if I took you back to 1971, we would be talking about a certain episode. And people watching and my panelists here will mention the episode. I'll show you a few little, photographs, but I will link it back to the Disney factor. So if you just bear with me for a moment. That wouldn't be it, would it? Yeah, that's the Time War. That would be terrible if I did that. I still think I want to do the Time War. Do you think, shall we do the Time War? I think the Time War might be a good one. Let me just get it to the right place. That would help. What I'm wanting to show you is... You get there in the end, you know, perseverance. I was always telling the kids, perseverance, keep going, add to your bloopers, why not? So basically, if I just show you all there, January the 2nd, 1971, Terror of the Autons, Part 1, 5:15 p.m., 7.3 million, just to give context. Now, this one episode, as you know, changed an awful lot to do with Doctor Who. Has anyone got memories? Or if not memories, remember watching this and thinking at the time how much this will change Doctor Who? Because we all go on about canon all the time. We had the introduction of the whole unit team proper this time, didn't we? New characters. We obviously had the Joe Grant meeting the Doctor and that partnership starting. We had obviously the introduction of the Master. We had the Time Lord Gentleman hovering in the air. We had the tissue decompression eliminator. You had a whole load of things introduced in this one episode, this one story. Suddenly, Doctor Who, the universe was changing a bit. Anybody got any thoughts on Terror of the Autons Part 1? Going back.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that's obviously jumping out there is the color. In terms of it being in color, I didn't see Doctor Who in color for another 3 and a bit years because they didn't have color television, which didn't have. I remember sort of like being old enough to watch it and them say, "Oh, and it's all color from now on." Just thinking, well, it's not for me. And I do wonder sometimes whether, in terms of how this watches and how this streams, whether, a lot of the stuff that says you can do this, you can do that. Can everyone do this? Does everyone have access? So, obviously, Doctor Who Classics available on BritBox. Is it easily accessible around other places? Obviously, people with VPNs can do it, but does everyone know how to use a VPN? Technology of Doctor Who is that the technology of watching it affects it just as much.
Any thoughts, Michelle or John? I mean, what I'm trying to link to, by the way, with any of your thoughts on Terror of the Autons is we're talking about the Disney factor. If this is in Doctor Who canon, but they're not going to stream it, but would you think, if I was a Disney executive, are there any problems with the Terror of the Autons story?
No, funnily enough, it's funny she mentioned Disneyfication, because if you took Terror of the Autons and compared it to the season before, a lot of fans would have been up in arms saying, "Oh, they've Disneyfied Doctor Who," because all of a sudden, the hard-hitting, industrialized world of season 7 was replaced by a more colourful, Hugh's right, by a more flashbang wallop type of Doctor Who than season 9. In fact, Barry Letts and Terence Dicks were eventually be able to put into practice their version of Doctor Who, which was a lot more colourful, a lot more humorous, a lot less gritty, a lot less realistic than what had gone before. And guess what? It was still Doctor Who, and it went on to even greater heights in popularity throughout the Pertwee years, and would subsequently lead to everything else we got afterwards: Tom Baker, Sylvester McCoy, and beyond. So it just shows you that Doctor Who can schism, it can change, it can be absolutely something totally different, look different, feel different than what it did the year before or the season before. And guess what? Nobody dies. Well, apart from the guy in the lunchbox. But nobody dies. And the programme goes on to strength, provided you give it room to breathe and see it grow. So my advice is, as always, let's see what happens. Because had we judged the Terror of the Autons just on that alone, comparing it with the previous outing for the Autons, we would have probably thought they dumbed Doctor Who down, that they kidified it, all sorts of things about it. But no, now it is quite rightly seen for the classic that it is. It's a different take on the whole idea of plastics. It's Barry Letts and Terence Dicks putting their stamp very firmly on the programme. And you know what? It worked, because Doctor Who was still around a decade and more afterwards.
Michelle?
Well, I agree. And this is the reason why the show has succeeded and why it has lasted as long as it has, is that it does change. It changes every incarnation. Every bit of the show is always a little bit different than the way it become. And I think that is okay. And that is how the show will continue. And again, it will be, I will know what I like when I see it, and I will know what I dislike when I see it. And this idea of, and going from last week's discussion of drawing the thin line in the sand and saying, you have to make a decision, you have to cross it right now. That's just ridiculous.
I see. when you see the pictures of particularly episode 1, all three of you, do you see, I mean, just play the game, Disney executive looking at that now, would they have problems with the tissue decompression eliminator showing up now? As in, do you think, because I mean, the church on Ruby Road, did we have any deaths? I'm trying to think, apart from the Goblin King. I can't think of, this kind of cleaner version of adventure.
It's also a Christmas episode too. You have to look at the one that was meant to be. I think we're definitely going to see death. We're probably going to see some pretty gruesome death. We had a death in the episode before where the guy's being turned into balls. I mean, that's horrifying.
Yeah,
but we realize that it's being aired at 5 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the U.S. on Christmas Day. You have to understand the time and the place in the audience. You're not going to have a really gruesome death on Christmas Day.
And were you surprised, any of you, that the Goblin Son, for example, with the eating of the babies, which, I mean, I've got a sense of humor, but, the eating of the babies and all that stuff, the lyrics were very strong there. Just saying what you've just said, Michelle, would have been seen as more problematic, or
hold on, you can't have it both ways here. You can't say on the one hand they're being too softies because nobody's dying apart from the villain, and then say, and then we had this song about eating babies, which is about pretty dark and pretty grim. You can't have it both ways, Brendan. Either they are being too soft and allowing and thinking we're kiddifying the audience, or they're being too dark and having songs about eating babies. It's doing what Doctor Who does best. It's just being dark when it needs to be dark, and being light and frothy when it needs to be light and frothy. And Michelle's quite right. It was Christmas Day, and if we want to look back on all sorts of Doctor Who episodes, there's been loads of episodes where nobody died, and loads of episodes where everybody died. I'm looking at you, Horror of Fang Rock. So it's what Doctor Who does. Let's just take a chill pill and see what happens, because we've not yet had a proper shooty non-Christmas episode yet.
I think, in terms of asking the question about whether that would be acceptable, I think probably not that episode on that day is right. I think to an extent maybe some things would have changed. I think the thing that it underlines, though, is that the terror of the Autons was a much, much bigger change than anything we've seen at all since the return of Doctor Who, and arguably is the biggest change ever in terms of putting him on Earth more or less in the same time, with that type of concentration on the technology, the Bondification of rather than Disneyfication. And that was a huge change.
Well, that happened the season before, Hugh, to be honest. That happened with season 7 in Spirit from Space. So that change in format, which was forced on the production team by as a cost-cutting measure, a budget measure, had happened the season before. But you're right in the extent that it was seen by some as being too grim, too gritty, too realistic. And guess what? Barry Letts decided, let's make Doctor Who more of a fantastical, so you get more of a fantastical bent to the Doctor Who being on Earth than the season 7 mad scientist, Inferno, and that type thing was. And now we're at a junction now where we may well be seeing something similar happen to Doctor Who, that fantasy and more fantastical things may be about to happen. Who knows?
Well, it's interesting that that change happens because of something like a budgetary drop, and perhaps now what we see something is a big change because of budget increase.
Well, that's one of the discussion points that I've seen online and with journalists. Actually, if I just bring this up screen. When me and John did this with my PowerPoint, and I typed, I'll go big screen, everybody, so people can see it. But basically, let me just show you my main points. I'm not just saying what I feel. I'm just reflecting a lot of discussions I've had. So pick up on any of them in a moment, please. Disney wishes to rebrand the show season 1. I think we've discussed that. That's okay. Disney will not host any classic on New Who. We've discussed that. Rumors that Disney would encourage spin-offs and an expanded Whoniverse. There's one benefit, possibly. Disney's investment means enhanced sets and visual effects, and a lot of arguments were made about Beep the Meep, the Star Beast, more extras, that you can actually have bigger crowd scenes, that sort of thing with Disney's money. Disney's money will mean less creativity in writing, unencumbered by budget constraints. Now, we've just started touching on that. Disney's reputation for top VFX, well, it's been challenged a bit recently, and I've got a couple of references there. We've mentioned the creative possible chaos. We've mentioned the Americanization, we've mentioned the woke, and we've mentioned the dilution. So one or two things left there, folks. Just jumping on Hugh's point was about the budget, which means we can have enhanced effects, bigger crowd scenes, and all the rest, and maybe get more stars on the show. But will this create a possibility of lazier writing? Because, as you say, in that moment when there were tight budgetary constraints, Terror of the Autons was the production at the end of it. Everyone's having a pause for thought.
No, I'm just giving a chance for somebody else to say something other than me or you, to be honest. But look, there's nothing new here. I mean, whether it's increased budgets and stars, John Nathan Turner, when he took over the program in the 1980s, managed to secure a bigger budget. And he put it all up front where you could see it. So you had bigger name guest stars, you had a new version of the theme tune, a new version of effects, and the program probably looked glossier most of the time than it ever had done before. But effectively, Doctor Who was still the same product. It was the script editor with Christopher Bidmead made it more scientific. A lot of people didn't like season 18 because it was very dry and scientific. When Eric Saywood came on, it became very grimmer, darker, deadlier. And then when Andrew Cartmel eventually took over towards the end, again, took on a more mysterious and fantastical element to it. So Doctor Who constantly changed. It put the money up front. It got in bigger guest stars, which fans complained about for good or for bad. And would complain about these people even before seeing their performances. I'm looking at Nicholas Parsons here, who did a perfectly acceptable performance, great performance as the Vicar in Curse of Fenric, but the fans had him down as a game show host, so he's obviously going to be terrible. Here we are all these years later, still having the same arguments. The point is, and I hate to repeat myself, I'll make my judgment when I see it. I have concerns with Disney because Disney as a brand and what it does doesn't appeal to me. I hope that the creatives, the British creatives at Doctor Who, have the cojones to say, no, this is not that program. This is the way this program has to be. To go back to your thing about Davros, I tend to think that that wasn't forced on Russell Davies. I think Russell Davies sees himself now as a champion. The left is no longer left in terms of economics. It's got a bigger worldview about what left-leaning means and being left-wing is. And part of that is a man who could create characters and have them in chairs. I'm looking at Voyage of the Damned. Can, all those years later, criticise one of the long-standing Doctor Who characters and change it just because he can. And I think that's more likely to be... I would hesitate to think that's a Disney influence. And if it was, I'm sure had Russell Davies not wanted to do it, he would have fought the good fight for that. But he chose not to if it was forced on him. So I tend to think that he was making that decision for himself, and he was putting it out there to let the fans, fandom in particular, not fans, but fandom in particular, know this is my show and I'm ruling the roost here, and cop for that, if you like. So that was a huge, big, long point on my score then, but just the basics of it is Doctor Who constantly change. It depends who's in charge. But money, glossiness, guest stars don't make one iota of difference. Only the scripts and the writing make the difference.
So a question here, we're on the hour, so we're going to be rounding up in a moment, but if I could just ask this question. Okay, I don't want to keep, I'm comparing, but I don't want to keep kind of doing all of my little pieces here. But it's a round off about the future. These debates about the future of Doctor Who. We're talking about the Disney factor. If Disney continues to have editorial say, as part of a larger production group? Do you think we will? And I'm not making the point that because I'm an older Doctor Who fan, I want it my way. I understand what he was saying about change, but do you think there's a possibility, knowing what Disney are like with different franchises, that we will recognise the Doctor Who brand in the future?
I think almost certainly. I think the question is much more about Russell Davies on that one. I don't. I think what Disney or Disney Plus, and I think it's worth specifying that this is a streaming service that looks upon things differently from just making films as Disney once did. I think that what they might do is rub off a bit here, change something a bit there, but they are not going to be the main drivers on this. I just don't see it.
I agree. I think we will still be able to recognize the Doctor and elements of Doctor Who, because it is a brand and a unique IP that has withstood the test of time. I think we're also going culturally, and not just Disney. We're going into more of a fantasy-based entertainment. There is a new genre coming up now called, they're calling it fantasy. It's like fantasy romance put together, and that is also appealing to young women or late teen, early 20s, 30s women. So we're going to see more fantasy being brought into culture. So this is where cultural is going, and Doctor Who will respond to this interest in fantasy.
Hence why there was a hint, the rumor, I think you've seen it, Michelle, about the boyfriend and Shooty, that Disney are actually pushing for this. We understand.
We understand. And Russell T Davies is waiting to see if the fans will respond. So he's not completely rolling over to the suits. He's waiting for the fans to make the decision.
Which is weird, because recently we've all seen the text when he says tough, or he has an abrupt response to certain fans who were saying you shouldn't have changed Davros, or don't you understand it's not a wager. So it's interesting how in this regard he's willing to listen to fans, because I haven't heard much of that recently.
And I also think some of that's just his act on, the way he is also, but also an act. And also I do kind of find it tacky to a certain degree for fans to go on and attack a creative or a actor in a harsh way. You can say, hey, you just be polite about it. And I think he's responding more to some of it was just flat out rude. I'd be like, tough biscuits too, buddy.
Yeah.
To add to, I mean, you said it, John said it, I think Michelle, you've said it. I'm the Grinch. Devil's advocate, very difficult job. Garbage here says Sarah Jane was a change from Classic Who. New RTD from 2005 to 17 was a change, and overall was great entertainment since 2018, and now it's a completely different show. So I think from that, Garbage, you're saying we've always had change and we've always accepted change, and some of it, I assume, is for the best. I'm guessing from that, you're saying from 2018 onwards, it's a different show, therefore change not good. That's what I'm gathering from that, Garbage. Anybody want to react to that?
I've been rewatching New Who, and I think the one thing that I've really struggled with in terms of the rewatch is not, and I think made it a different show, is about the companions being more important than Doctor Who. And actually, in 2018, I thought it was the one thing that Chibnall did well was make the companions not the central story all the time. Because if I had another Clara nonsense, I honestly didn't see the point in that. And that really made it a different show for me. If Russell Davies goes down the whole something to do with Ruby being the main story, it's just back to a problem for me. The companions should be there to reflect us. I don't mean that in a Mary Sue sense. I mean that they're just people discovering something that is beyond their comprehension. If they are the thing that is beyond comprehension, then that's been a real problem for me.
I mean, Sarah Jane, we all know Sarah Jane was a great companion, but she argued with the Tom Baker Doctor at various points. Can Tom Baker, the as in the character, argued that he was alien and she needed to understand that. And of course, what you're saying, Hugh, is, yeah, if it was always companion-driven plots with our flaws, human flaws, and yet we have this alien character who can see a bigger picture, because sometimes humans can look parochial and very narrow-minded in their view, and he had a universe view, not a world view. And that's kind of what I kind of liked when I was a kid. John?
No, just I agree about the companion thing. The thing about writers, that they like to put words into their own creations rather than something's been created by someone else. The thing Tom Baker used to say was that Doctor Who was a part that nobody could fail at, because the character didn't really develop as such. Because of modern drama, the soap element, and all the rest of it, Doctor Who, each Doctor's had to have some sort of arc and develop across it, and that makes it more interesting for the writer to write, for them to attract new people to come and write for it, and that's the whole thing behind the companions having a bigger part now. I hesitate to think that was a particular strategy of Gibnall's. He just created these people and then forgot to put words in their mouths. Because he's a hack, quite frankly. He just paid for doing hee-haw, McGraw, as we say in Glasgow. But longer term, I don't know whether or not Disney's influence will be felt in Doctor Who. Again, time, as it always does, will tell. I have noticed Doctor Who's better in these last 4 specials, I think, than it was for the last 4 years. So that's positive.
Yeah.
It entertained me more. It put me on the edge of my seat more than it ever has done. So the trajectory is that way just now. Yeah, sure. David Tennant's return didn't produce mega viewing figures. Yeah, as other people have said in the chat, yeah, sure, Doctor Who's heyday may well be over and it might not come back. But is it still able to entertain, gain an audience, keep that audience and stick with it? So far, I think these 4 episodes say yes, it can, because Doctor Who has trebled the audience it had over the last couple of years, and that audience hopefully can grow when we start the new season proper. If the new season proper turns out to be something that none of us as older Doctor Who fans particularly like, then we can say goodbye to it. We can put it down and move on to something else, and let other generations and other people who do like it enjoy it, because it just doesn't belong to us.
I think I know what you're saying. I think the issue has been the 4 specials stand, etc. And yes, it's a vast difference to what came before. I think it's the behind the scenes gossip and nonsense, on Unleashed. Russell Davies.
Which is why I don't watch those programs.
The fans.
Don't watch it then. If you don't want to be annoyed, don't watch it. Watch the program and judge it on the product in front of you. End of story.
It's like in the House of the Dragons. I originally started watching it on HBO Max, and then they would play the 10 minutes after it would be the talking heads, and it's just annoying. And then when we got HBO Max and I could regular HBO on broadcast, they didn't play that, and it was much more enjoyable without the talking heads. And sometimes I think they need to go back to less is more. The way it was back in the old days. Now, the fact that everyone has technology and you can message Russell T Davies and he has all these podcasts and all these Unleashed, there's almost a little too much going on. There's a little too much going on. And of course, you're going to, and then when you talk more, you're going to have more chance to irritate somebody.
And since one of our shows in future is going to be comparing RTD to RTD2, and we talked about the Disney influence here, Crimpling de Bloom was saying, I wonder if Disney may influence Russell to appear friendlier towards fans rather than spiteful, if only as a better way to market the product to the customers. Now, I know Jane Tranter had a word with him after an awards ceremony, but you can see here, maybe
tell me about that.
Yeah, I haven't heard that rumor.
Yeah, it was from our friend on another channel who actually explained that Jane Tranter from Bad Wolf had to have a little chat with him about when he talked about the Tories and the government, and he had a bit of a rant as part of the awards ceremony. and I think they asked him to tone that down.
Yeah.
in
Because
this
as you keep saying, Doctor Who's not just for people who lean left. Doctor Who's for everybody. So, and it may well be, what Russell Davies is good at is when he writes something like Queer as Folk or It's a Sin, you can enjoy the politics of that without sharing the politics of that. He's telling a story. He's telling the story about the story of AIDS in the 80s and what it did to families, and how, and he told in Queer as Folk, he told a story about, being gay is not about AIDS. It's not about suffering and dying and everything, because everything in the 90s and the 80s seemed to be about that. But if I was to watch Russell T Davies' version of Doctor Who now, and he's got a subliminal message and then a deathly put message, and then I go and watch Doctor Who Unleashed and he's hammering home, a strategy about trans or about how he hates the Conservatives and whatever, then I'd probably go, oh God, leave me alone, leave me alone, leave me alone. If I just watch the programme, listen to all that cant, might not have upset me. So
yeah, so I think the crucial programme in the Russell T Davies canon for that is Years and Years, which is distinctly political. I mean, I think the other ones have a political take, but they're not party political, whereas Years and Years was party political. And I think that's a problem in Doctor Who, because it does have it always has had, to a certain extent, a liberal in the small L sense and in the British liberal sense of message, but it's not been party political, really, and it's managed to avoid that despite the fact that it's quite common in other programmes, and that would be a problem.
Yeah.
And I say that as someone who's on the left.
Yeah. I mean, we all know Malcolm Hulke. We've had various versions throughout the history of Doctor Who where we know they've been quite overly political, but
what we didn't have after the Green Death or after the Curse of Peladon was a program with Malcolm Hulke telling us how left-wing he was. So that's what we didn't have.
Yes, and I think I agree. I mean, we all want more, but actually, the more you get, the more you hear, and the more it actually puts you off. So maybe the less is more. Yeah, I know, it's the classic.
And also, in before we leave the talk about being nicer to the fans, I think we are starting to see this in the next year. Before that, Disney kind of let everybody say what they wanted to say, and there was some really nasty online fighting, and particularly with things like Obi-Wan Kenobi and racism. I mean, of course, there's always going to be, there were some really, nasty comments, but they're kind of hyping up this idea that if you didn't like this character, it was because you were racist. And then we see last year with the rumors behind the actress, and her name escapes me, she's playing the new Snow White, and some of the things that she is being was said, and the rumors coming out that she's been called to the carpet, actually got called in to meet with Bob Iger, who was the head of Disney, and was really giving a scolding on some of the things that she was saying, and basically telling the tone down. And also that movie has gone through massive re-edits and keeps getting delayed. It also goes back to the rumor that Doctor Who was originally supposed to air in March and April, and now it's being delayed to May, June. And one of the rumors is that they're re-editing. So I think we're also seeing a shift in the Disney Corporation. They had a horrible 2023. 2022 wasn't all that great either. And they may be starting to back down from some of their over the top, political messaging, and going back to where it should be a little bit more, under the curve, where you can make any interpretation that you want.
And isn't that fascinating? Just to bring it back to your question, Brendan, that it may well be, if that's the case, we could speculate that it could be Disney that saves Doctor Who from Russell Davies, rather than Russell Davies saving Doctor Who from Disney.
Yeah, you've beat me to it. I was just thinking that is the consensus, really. I mean, people are watching this show and that people have been worried. I mean, I think concern with Doctor Who has been there a little while, but is our consensus really? I think I have to be fair. I think the consensus sounds like we're saying that the Disney factor actually may do more than actually just give us more budget, etc. They may actually be saving us from the the sharper end of Russell T's tongue in the long term, and it actually might tone a few things down.
We don't know. As I said, time will tell. We'll have to wait and see. But over the course of this argument, over the course of this discussion, I've always been a fan of Russell Davies. I think Doctor Who existed because of him. I love his writing. I like the dramas he creates in all the restorations. I don't share his politics. I'm not on the left. Quite happy to admit that. But when he's not being overtly party political, he writes blooming good television, and I would hate to think that this time round he sees Doctor Who as a tool in his armory for a particular political, if not party political, way of making that clear. And if that is the case, and that's why I think he's not as deft as he was. So the Davros thing, I can put that down to him perhaps, and other things that we might have said regarding trans and what have you. But if that is the case, as I say, maybe Disney's commercial head will save Doctor Who from the wilder excesses of someone who's out of control. Maybe.
So it might not be a mousetrap after all.
Yeah.
It was his statements in the Imagine program that really worried me. I'd say I'm perfectly happy to have the politics. There will always be politics in Doctor Who to some extent or another. That's fine. But it was his mention of years and years and feeling that the shackles had come off at that point. And I thought, well, I wasn't a million miles away from agreeing with years and years, but I was very conscious of the fact that it was an exclusionary tactic which divides the audience and halves it, more or less. And if that happened to Doctor Who, I think you would lose the discussion and the inclusion that I think is important to it.
It looks as though I'm going to have to hire Hugh as a promotion for the channel because he's advertising our other shows, everybody. We did a review of the Russell Davies Imagine documentary, so please go and have a look at that because it was a really interesting discussion, wasn't it, Hugh? In fact, we ended up longer than the documentary because there were some really interesting issues there. So please, yes, I think I'm going to hire him as our promoter there. So anyway, thanks for your time, everybody. Thanks, Michelle, from...
Thank you.
America. Thanks, Hugh and John, closer to home in Glasgow. And you've just watched the 10th programme of the Sense Sphere in about 3.5 weeks. We're doing all right. And thank you for all your goodwill. And thanks to everybody at home for their kindness and support. We will keep going. More Doctor Who debates to come. Bye now, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.